They sent 12 Green Berets into a forest that time had forgotten. The official target was a drug lab, but the silence was unnatural. The footprints weren't human, and the captain's last warning echoed in our minds. If you see children, do not approach. We thought we were the hunters. We were wrong. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me where you're watching this story from. I should never have gone back to that forest. My name is Michael Corrigan, formerly Sergeant First Class 7th Special Forces Group. For years I swore I'd take this story to my grave. But after what I saw on that mission in the Sierra Madre, after what I heard on that long black night, silence feels like its own kind of damnation. It feels like a lie. It started like any other high-risk reconnaissance op. We called it Operation Sundown. Harmless enough. The briefing room at Fort Bliss was cold, smelling of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Maps of a desolate, mountainous region of northern Mexico were projected on the screen, a jagged spine of rock and pine that straddled the border between Durango and Sinaloa. The National Reconnaissance Office had picked up anomalous thermal signatures, human-sized clusters, in an area that was, officially, uninhabited. The last of the indigenous Tepehuan villages had been evacuated in the 80s after a series of catastrophic mudslides. The working theory, the one they gave us grunts, was a new high-altitude cartel superlab. El Chapo's people were getting creative, pushing their operations into places no one would ever think to look. Our ODA, Operational Detachment Alpha 724, was tasked with putting boots on the ground. A simple recon. Enfil observe report exfil. Don't engage unless compromised. We were the best. 12 Green Berets, each a specialist in our own deadly art. Our commander, Captain Hayes, was a man carved from granite, with eyes that had seen too much and a voice that never rose above a measured calm. But that day something was off. Hayes stood before the screen, reading a section of the classified annex, a thin file with red borders. The room was quiet, the only sound the hum of the projector. He was silent for a full minute, his jaw tight. When he finally looked up, his eyes didn't scan the room. They seemed to look through us, at something far away and unpleasant. Standard rules of engagement are in effect, he said, his voice flat. But there's an addendum from Langley. Threat identification is paramount. You do not fire without positive visual confirmation of a weapon. That was standard. But then he paused, turning a page. And he added, his gaze finally meeting ours one by one. If you see children, you do not approach. You do not engage. You pull back and you call it in. Is that understood? The question hung in the sterile air. Children? In a cartel superlab? We exchanged confused glances. Specialist Davis, our tracker, and the quietest man on the team shifted in his seat. Kowalski, our breacher who feared nothing, actually frowned. Cartels used child soldiers, sicarios. But the order wasn't neutralize the threat. It was do not approach. It was an order of avoidance. An order of fear, sir, I asked, breaking the silence. Are we expecting civilian presence? Hayes's eyes locked onto mine. There was no information in them, just a wall. We are expecting the unexpected, Sergeant. The thermal scans are inconsistent. The heat signatures cluster and disperse in ways that don't match known patterns. Intelligence has no idea what's really going on in there. So we stick to the script. We are ghosts. We observe and we report, especially anything unusual. The word hung in the air, unusual. In our line of work, unusual was a sliding scale that started at bad and ended at dead. We were dismissed, and as we filed out to prep our gear, the unease lingered. We were soldiers trained to run toward the sound of the guns, to face down any enemy. But the captain's order felt different. It wasn't about protecting civilians. It was a warning. It felt like we were being told not to startle something that was better left sleeping, something that lived in a place that had been wiped off the maps for a reason. As I packed my magazines, the sterile air of the briefing room was replaced by a phantom scent in my mind, of damp earth, of pine needles, and of something else. Something old and hungry. The whisper of the Sierra was calling, and we were about to answer. 3 a.m. The world exists in shades of green and black when you're looking through night vision goggles. The twin rotors of the MH-60 Blackhawk thundered, a violent heartbeat against the cold, thin air of the high desert. We flew low nap of the earth, 2 birds skimming over the jagged teeth of the mountains, that separated our world from theirs. Inside, no one spoke. The 12 of us were a self-contained unit of lethal potential, each man lost in his own pre-mission ritual. I ran a thumb over the cold steel of my rifle. The familiar weight a small comfort against the gnawing uncertainty. The wind coming off the Sierra was a physical thing, a predator that slammed against the fuselage. The pilot's voice crackled in our headsets, strained. "LZ is hot, boys. Weather's turning nasty. You've got 5 minutes." As we crossed the invisible line of the border, our comms began to degrade. First a light crackle of static, then a persistent rolling hiss like a tide of white noise washing over the frequency. "Command, this is Ghost 1, Hayes said, his voice tight with annoyance. "Comms check." The reply was a garbled mess of noise. "Damn it," he muttered, switching to our internal team channel. "Short range only from here on out. We're on our own." The feeling of isolation was immediate and profound. We were a tiny island of technology and training, in an ocean of primitive wilderness. The Black Hawks flared for landing in a small rocky clearing that looked like it had been a logging camp a century ago. The moment the skids touched down, we were out, fanning into a defensive perimeter. The air hit me first. It was thick, heavy with the smell of pine resin and wet soil. But underneath was a cloying layer of something else, the smell of decay. Not the clean decay of a forest floor, but something meaty, sickly. The helicopters lifted off, their rotor wash tearing at the trees, and then they were gone. The silence that fell in their wake was absolute. It wasn't peaceful. It was a dead silence. No crickets, no birdsong, not even the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. All the normal sounds of a living forest had been choked out. There was only the sound of our own breathing, and the low moan of the wind as it squeezed through the tight canyons. It sounded like an animal in pain. "All right," Hayes's voice was a low whisper in our ears. "Let's move." "Davis, you're on point. Let's find what's making those campfires." We moved out in a staggered file, a dozen green-hued ghosts slipping between ancient, monolithic pines. The forest floor was a soft carpet of damp needles that swallowed the sound of our boots. The trees were so thick that the moonlight, weak as it was, couldn't penetrate the canopy. We were in a green-tinted cathedral of shadow. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when Davis stopped, holding up a clenched fist. The entire team froze in place, weapons raised. I crept up to his position. He was crouched low, his gloved hand hovering over a mark in the damp earth. "What is it, Tracker?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the impression. Through my NVGs, I saw it clearly. Our footprint. But it was all wrong. It was too big for one thing. Longer and wider than my size 12 boot. It had the general shape of a human foot, but the toes were too long, ending in what looked like deep claw marks gouged into the soil. And the depth of it. Whatever made this print was heavy, incredibly heavy. "Looks like a bear, maybe," Kowalski whispered from behind me. Davis finally shook his head, his face a mask of concentration. "No," he breathed. "The pressure distribution is all wrong for a bear. The gate is bipedal." He looked up, his eyes wide and luminous in the green glow. "It's walking on 2 legs." Hayes came forward, studying the track. His face was unreadable. "Log it," he said, his voice as cold as the mountain air. "And follow it." A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, coiled in my gut. This wasn't cartel. This wasn't anything we had trained for. We were following the footsteps of a monster, and the dead, silent forest felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what we would do next. The green hell had swallowed us whole. Following the tracks was like following a ghost. They led us deeper into the primordial gloom, up a steep, winding incline where the trees grew thicker and more ancient. Davis moved with a preternatural focus, his senses dialed to a frequency the rest of us couldn't perceive. He was our tracker, a kid from rural Montana who could read a story in a single broken twig. But the story he was reading now was one he didn't understand. And the confusion on his face was more unsettling than any sound in the dark. The tracks were consistent, bipedal, heavy, a long, loping stride that ate up the ground. Occasionally we'd find a second set, smaller, but with the same unnatural shape. We were following more than one. After another hour, the sickly sweet smell we'd noticed at the LZ grew stronger, almost suffocating. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse left to rot in the sun. It clung to the back of the throat and made you want to gag. It was then that we saw it. Through a break in the trees, A structure stood silhouetted against the slightly less black sky. It was a crude log cabin, the kind a frontiersman might have built 200 years ago, but it was destroyed. The roof was gone, torn away as if by a hurricane. The log walls were splintered and broken, and deep parallel gouges were raked down the timber, some of them a foot long. They were claw marks made with impossible force. "Hold position," Hayes ordered, his voice a low growl. "Corrigan, Kowalski with me. Everyone else, perimeter." We moved toward the ruin like men approaching an unexploded bomb. The air was thick with the stench. My rifle felt slick with sweat in my hands. Every shadow seemed to writhe with unseen life. Kowalski took the broken doorway, rifle up, while I covered the gaping hole where a window used to be. Hayes swept the interior with his weapon-mounted light. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene of utter devastation. The inside was small, a single room. A primitive hearth stood cold on one end. But the floor was littered with bones, not animal bones. They were small, delicate. Splintered ribs, cracked vertebrae, fragments of a tiny pelvis, and skulls. There were at least 3, all small, all fractured. The jawbones were too small to be from adults. Hayes's light lingered on one, and I saw a detail that made my blood run cold. The teeth were wrong. The canines were too long, too sharp, almost like tiny fangs. "Jesus Christ," Kowalski breathed, his voice tight. "What happened here?" This wasn't a cartel execution site. This was something else. A nest, a lair, and it had been raided, violently. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on bone fragments. The smell was overpowering now. The metallic tang of old blood mixed with the sweet rot of decay. I scanned the floor with my own light, trying to make sense of the carnage. That's when I saw it, half buried in the dirt and bone dust near the hearth. It was a small, crudely carved object no bigger than my hand. I knelt, pushing aside a piece of shattered bone, and picked it up. It was made of dark wood, worn smooth by countless touches. It was a figurine, a wolf, but it wasn't a normal wolf. It was standing on its hind legs, its arms outstretched, its wooden face carved into a silent, snarling howl. It was a child's toy. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over me. The small bones, the toy, the little footprints we had seen alongside the larger ones. This wasn't just a lair. It was a nursery, a cradle, and it had been broken. "Captain," I said, my voice hoarse. I held up the wooden wolf. Hayes looked at it, then back at the scattered remains. For the first time since I'd known him, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It was a dawning, horrified understanding. The mission parameters suddenly clicked into place with sickening clarity. "If you see children, do not approach." Langley hadn't been worried about us hurting children. They had been worried about what the parents would do if we did. My headset crackled to life. It was the other fire team, Bravo, positioned half a click to our east. The voice belonged to Sergeant Miller, a man known for his unshakable calm, but his voice was trembling, stretched thin with panic. "Ghost Lead, this is Bravo. We have movement. Multiple contacts on the perimeter. God, they're not men." The transmission dissolved into a burst of static, but not before one last chilling word came through. "Humanoid." A new sound cut through the dead silence of the forest. It started low, a guttural vibration that seemed to come from the very ground beneath our feet, and it rose into a long, deep metallic growl that was filled with ancient menace, and the hunt began. The growl was a physical presence. It wasn't just a sound you heard with your ears. It was a pressure wave that hit you in the chest, vibrating through your bones and teeth. It was the sound of a predator announcing its domain, and we were the trespassers. "All stations, report." Hayes snapped into the mic, his voice betraying none of the shock we all felt. We fell back from the cabin, forming a tight, circular perimeter, our rifles pointed out into the oppressive darkness. "Bravo, sound off." Only static answered. Her thick, wet fog began to roll down from the higher elevations, slithering between the trees like a living thing. It swallowed the faint moonlight, plunging us into an even deeper blackness. Our NVGs struggled to cut through the moisture, turning the world into a swirling, indistinct soup of green and grey. The temperature dropped. The air grew heavy, trapping the stench of rot and our own panicked sweat. Another growl echoed from our left flank, answered by a third from our right. They were talking to each other, coordinating, My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, terrifying silence that followed. They were toying with us. PFC Farrow, the youngest man on the team, was next to me. It was his first real combat deployment. I could hear his breathing, fast and shallow over the comms. His rifle barrel was trembling. "Stay calm, kid," I muttered, my voice tight. "Scan your sector. Don't get tunnel vision." "I can't see anything, Sarge," he whispered back, his voice cracking. "There's nothing out there." But there was. We could all feel it. The forest was no longer empty. It was full. The silence was the coiled spring tension of a dozen predators waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The wind picked up, rustling the high branches, and for a second I thought I saw movement in the canopy. A large, dark shape, flitting between branches with impossible agility. I blinked and it was gone. A trick of the light. A trick of my frayed nerves. Then the growl came again, this time from directly in front of us, and it was close. So close I could feel the ground shake. That's when Farrow broke. His training, his discipline, all of it evaporated in a single primal surge of terror. He flicked the switch on his weapon light. A brilliant 800-lumen beam of white light sliced through the fog, a beacon in the absolute dark. "Farrow, kill the light." "Kill it now!" Hayes roared, but it was too late. For a split second the beam illuminated the tree line, and in that stark white light we saw them. Eyes, a pair of them glowing with a sickly yellow-green luminescence like phosphorus. They weren't the low-set eyes of a wolf or a bear. They were high off the ground, at least 7, maybe 8 feet high. They stared back unblinking, filled with a cold alien intelligence. Before anyone could process what we were seeing, the creature moved. It didn't run. It launched itself from the darkness. There was a sound like a giant tree splitting down the middle, a crack of immense power, and a shape blacker than the surrounding night hurtled out of the fog. It was on Farrow in less than a heartbeat. It was huge, a mountain of muscle and matted black fur, moving with a speed that defied its bulk. I saw long, powerful limbs, a broad, stooped torso, and claws like curved daggers. Farrow never even had time to scream. The creature hit him with the force of a freight train. The sound was a wet, sickening crunch of bone and meat. Farrow was thrown backward, his body ragdolling through the air for a dozen feet, before slamming into a tree with a final, definitive thud. His light spun away, its beam cutting a frantic, crazy arc through the fog-choked woods, illuminating brief, nightmarish flashes of fur and teeth and blood. The creature stood over his broken body, and for a terrible, frozen second it turned its head toward us. The flashlight's wild beam caught its face. It was not the face of an animal. It was a grotesque parody of a human face, a twisted, elongated snout filled with oversized teeth, but the eyes. The eyes were recessed under a heavy, bony brow, and they burned with a malevolent, thinking hatred. Then it let out a roar, a deafening, triumphant blast of sound that tore through the night, and the forest erupted. The roar was our starting gun. My training took over, overriding the paralysis of pure terror. My rifle was already at my shoulder. I squeezed the trigger, sending a 3-round burst at the hulking shape over Farrow's body. The sound of my M4 was deafening in the enclosed space, the muzzle flash a brilliant repeating strobe. The rest of the team opened up a half-second later. The night exploded into a cacophony of controlled chaos. The staccato bark of our rifles, the strobing flashes of light, the acrid smell of gunpowder cutting through the stench of decay. The clearing became a kill zone. My rounds hit the creature in the chest. I saw the impacts, puffs of fur and something dark and wet flying into the air. It staggered back, letting out a guttural shriek of pain and rage, but it didn't go down. It was like shooting at a brick wall. It glared at me, those yellow eyes locking onto mine for a terrifying instant, before it melted back into the fog and the trees. "Contact front! Contact right!" Davis yelled, his voice steady despite the madness. "They're flanking us!" He was right. The muzzle flashes from our weapons gave us fleeting, strobe-lit glimpses of our attackers. They weren't a disorganized mob of beasts. They were a coordinated hunting party. Dark, towering shapes moved through the trees on all sides, using the terrain with the practiced ease of seasoned guerrillas. They were fast, impossibly fast, flitting between the massive pine trunks, staying in the shadows, presenting only fleeting targets. It was a devil's dance in the dark. A flash of movement, a burst of gunfire, A snarling grunt from the trees, an answering volley of lead. The fog worked to their advantage, turning the fight into a close-quarters nightmare. We were firing at shadows, at sounds, at the glint of an eye in the dark. "Kowalski, frag out!" 3 o'clock, Hayes commanded. Kowalski pulled a grenade, yanked the pin, and lobbed it into the trees. The explosion was a concussive boom that shook the ground, followed by a high-pitched scream of pain that wasn't human. For a moment there was a lull on that flank. "Reloading!" I yelled, dropping my empty mag and slapping a fresh one home. My hands were slick with sweat, but my movements were automatic, drilled into my muscle memory by thousands of hours of practice. In that brief moment of quiet, I heard it. A sound behind me, a low, wet, guttural breathing. I spun around, bringing my rifle up. Nothing, just the swirling grey fog. But I knew something had been there, inches away. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. They were inside our perimeter. "They're behind us," I shouted, just as a scream came from the other side of our circle. It was one of the Bravo team guys who had managed to fall back to our position. The scream was cut short with a sickening, wet, tearing sound. We were being dismantled, picked apart one by one. These things weren't just strong and fast. They were smart. They understood tactics. They were drawing our fire in one direction, while another group slipped in from the opposite side. This wasn't a panicked animal attack. This was a methodical extermination. I fired another burst at a shape that lunged from the fog, all claws and teeth. The muzzle flash illuminated its face for a horrifying instant. The elongated snout, the matted black fur, the misshapen, almost human features, twisted in a mask of feral rage. It was like looking at a nightmare given flesh, something that crawled out of the darkest corners of human folklore. "Fall back to the rocks," Hayes ordered, his voice cutting through the din. "Form a tighter perimeter. Conserve your ammo." We started a fighting retreat, moving backward, covering each other. But they pressed their attack relentless. For every one we thought we hit, 2 more seemed to take its place. My mind reeled. How many were there? The thermal scans had shown a cluster, but this felt like an army. Then, through a momentary thinning of the fog, I saw one of them stumble and fall under a concentrated burst from Davis's saw. It landed heavily in the small clearing, twitching. "Got one!" Davis yelled. But as the fog swirled around the downed creature, I noticed something. It was smaller than the others. Much smaller. Not a 7-foot giant, but maybe the size of a large man or a teenager. The thought barely had time to register before the forest fell silent again, an even more menacing silence than before. We had hurt one of them. We had done more than just trespass. We had drawn blood. The silence was a vacuum. The sudden absence of gunfire and snarling was more terrifying than the chaos it replaced. All I could hear was the ragged sound of our own breathing, the frantic thumping of my heart, and the slow, heavy drip of moisture from the towering pines. The fog coiled around us, a silent grey shroud. We stood in our tight circle, weapons trained on the impenetrable darkness, muscles screaming with tension. Every snap of a twig, every moan of the wind was a new threat. "Status report." Hayes's voice was strained, but it held its command. "Miller's gone," someone choked out. "And Farrow." We did a quick head count. We were down to 8. A third of our team gone in less than 5 minutes. The creature Davis had shot lay in the middle of our small perimeter, maybe 20 yards away. It was still, but a low-pained whining sound emanated from it, the sound of a wounded animal. "Is it dead?" Kowalski asked, his voice a low rumble. "Don't know," Davis replied. "Let's find out." "Hold position," Hayes ordered. "No one moves." But Davis was already creeping forward, his saw held at the low ready. He was our tracker. He had a need to see things up close, to understand what he was fighting. I saw the conflict on Hayes's face, but he didn't repeat the order. We all needed to know. We needed to see our enemy, to put a face to the horror that was hunting us. I covered Davis as he moved, my rifle sight trained on the space just beyond the body, expecting another creature to burst from the fog at any second. He reached the body and knelt, cautiously at first, then with a sudden stillness. He didn't move for a long moment. He just stared down at the creature. He lowered his weapon. "Davis, what is it?" Hayes demanded. "Report!" Davis didn't seem to hear. He reached out a trembling, gloved hand. not to the creature's wounds but to its face, pushing back a clump of matted, blood-soaked fur. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a strangled whisper, broken with disbelief and horror. It was a sound I will never forget. "Captain," he said, his voice cracking. "Oh my God. Captain, it's just a kid." A wave of cold incomprehension washed over me. Kid, what was he talking about? I took a few steps forward, joining him. Kowalski and a few others did the same, drawn by the terrible note in his voice. And then I saw it. Lying on the damp pine needles was not the monster I had seen in the muzzle flashes. The body was slender under the coarse black fur. The limbs were long and gangly, like those of an adolescent still growing into their frame. But it was the face that shattered my reality. It was a terrible, tragic hybrid of man and beast. The jaw was elongated into a short snout, lined with those needle-sharp teeth, but the forehead was high and broad. The nose was flat and wide, but recognizably a nose, and under the closed eyelids, the shape of the sockets was undeniably human. It was the face of a horribly deformed child, maybe 14 or 15 years old, covered in the pelt of a wolf. Its hands, even with their long claw-like nails, had 5 fingers. The unspeakable truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. The small bones in the cabin, the carved toy, the captain's warning. These weren't monsters, or at least they weren't just monsters. They were a people, a tribe, a family, and we had just shot their child. We stood there, frozen, soldiers trained for every conceivable combat scenario, utterly unprepared for this. We were staring at our own monstrous act. Before we could process the full weight of what we'd done, a new sound ripped through the forest. It was not the predatory growl from before. This was a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish, a roar of heartbroken fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. It came from all around us, a chorus of parental grief and rage. The hunt was no longer about territory. Now it was personal. The roar of grief changed everything. The air grew colder, heavier. The calculated tactical strikes against our perimeter stopped. The new strategy was one of pure psychological terror. They were no longer just trying to kill us. They were trying to break us. Sounds began to come from the fog. Not just growls, but other noises. The sound of something heavy being dragged through the undergrowth. The sharp crack of a large branch being snapped. And whispers, low guttural whispers, in a language that was all clicks and deep-throated rasps, but that somehow sounded like mocking laughter. They were circling us, always out of sight, letting our imaginations do their work. Every man was on edge, his nerves stretched to the breaking point. We had backed up against a large rock outcropping, putting something solid to our backs, but it only made us feel more trapped. We were in a cage of trees and the keepers were circling. "Stay tight," Hayes said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Don't let them separate us. Watch your buddy." But they were masters of this place. A dark shape would dart across a gap in the fog on one side, drawing a burst of panicked fire. While our attention was fixed there, a rock would come sailing out of the darkness from the other side, crashing into the trees above our heads. They were testing our defenses, finding the weak points, fraying our discipline. Then they took the captain. It happened so fast, it was almost impossible to comprehend. He was positioned on the right edge of our formation, near me. One of the creatures, bigger than any we had seen so far, a true giant, easily 9 feet tall, burst from the tree line with no warning. It wasn't a charge. It was an explosion of motion. It ignored the rest of us. It had a target. Before Hayes could even swing his rifle around, the creature's arm as thick as a tree trunk shot out and wrapped around his chest. Hayes let out a choked cry as he was lifted off his feet, his boots kicking uselessly in the air. His rifle clattered to the ground. "Captain!" I screamed, opening fire. Kowalski and 2 others did the same, pouring rounds into the creature's massive back and shoulders. The bullets hit with wet, meaty thuds, but it didn't even seem to notice. It was a moving mountain of muscle and rage. With Hayes held tight against its chest like a broken doll, it turned and plunged back into the forest. We heard one final, desperate shout from our commander, then a sickening heavy crunch, and then silence. The effect on our morale was devastating. They hadn't just killed our leader. They had taken him, abducted him. It was an act of terrifying intimacy. It broke our formation, our will to fight. We were no longer a Special Forces ODA. We were just 7 terrified men lost in the dark, being hunted by things that shouldn't exist. Panic began to set in. One of the younger soldiers started firing blindly into the trees, screaming incoherently. I had to tackle him, pinning him to the ground to make him stop. "Save your ammo," I yelled in his face, my own voice shaking. "You're wasting it!" We were falling apart. The creatures knew it. The whispers grew louder, closer. The ground seemed to vibrate with their unseen movements. And then a new sound cut through the nightmare. It was clear, sharp, and utterly unexpected. It wasn't a growl or a whisper or the sound of violence. It was a human scream. A woman's scream, high-pitched, filled with pain and desperation. It came from deeper in the woods, in the direction they had dragged Captain Hayes. We all froze, listening. It came again, a raw, piercing cry for help. My training, my very soul screamed at me to stay put. It was a trap. It had to be a trap, a lure to draw us out from our defensive position into the open. But it sounded so real, so human. "What do we do, Sarge?" a trembling voice asked me. I was the senior NCO left. I was in command now. The protocol was clear: hold position, wait for extraction. But the man inside the uniform, the man who had just seen his captain carried off like a child, couldn't ignore that scream. Maybe it was a civilian. Maybe the cartel did have prisoners up here. Maybe Hayes was still alive. It was a stupid, suicidal hope. But it was the only hope we had. "Cover me," I said, my voice hoarse. "We're going to find out what that is." We left the relative safety of the rocks and plunged back into the cage of trees, moving toward the sound, moving toward the heart of the darkness. Moving toward that scream was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every instinct, honed by years of combat, told me I was leading my men into the killing jar. The forest seemed to press in on us, the fog clinging to our gear like a damp shroud. The guttural whispers and growls had faded, replaced by an unnerving silence, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, watching to see what the foolish humans would do. We moved in a tight diamond formation, covering all angles, stepping over roots that looked like grasping claws in the green haze of our night vision. The scream came again, closer this time, and it ended in a long, shuddering sob. We broke through a thicket of ferns and stopped dead. We had found the source of the sound. It was a small clearing, dominated by a single ancient cedar tree whose roots buckled the earth. At the base of that tree was a woman. She was kneeling in the mud, completely naked, her body caked in a mixture of dirt and what looked like dried blood. Her long black hair was a tangled mess, and one side of her face was a mass of scarred, burned tissue that pulled her lips into a permanent snarl. And she wasn't alone. Cradled in her arms, held tightly to her chest, was the body of the small creature Davis had shot. The adolescent, her child. She wasn't screaming for help. She was mourning. The sound we had heard wasn't a cry of fear. It was a cry of profound, soul-shattering loss. She looked up as we emerged from the trees, and her eyes, I will never forget her eyes. They weren't the glowing yellow orbs of the hunters. They were human eyes, dark, deep, and filled with a hatred so pure and so absolute. It was like looking into the sun. There was no fear in her gaze, only judgment. She looked at us, at our high-tech weapons and body armor, and saw only murderers. One of the men, a new recruit named Peterson, raised his rifle. His nerves were shot. "It's a trap," he stammered. "She's one of them." "Stand down, Peterson," I hissed, pushing his rifle barrel toward the ground. "Don't you dare." The woman watched the exchange, her expression unchanging. She rocked her dead child in her arms, a low, keening moan starting deep in her chest. Then she opened her mouth and she spoke. Or something like it. The words were not in any language I knew. They were a cascade of harsh, guttural sounds, clicks and deep vowels. It was a language as old as the mountains themselves. But I didn't need a translator to understand the tone. It was an accusation, a curse. My blood ran cold. The truth of our situation settled over me with a crushing weight. The thermal signatures weren't a cartel lab. They were a family, the last of a tribe maybe, something that had hidden in these mountains for centuries, evolving, changing into this something between man and beast. We hadn't stumbled onto an enemy operation. We had invaded a home. We had walked into their nursery and been repulsed by what we found. And in our fear and confusion, we had killed their young. The ground began to tremble, a low, deep vibration that resonated up through the soles of my boots. From the fog, from the shadows behind the trees, they emerged, not with a rush but with a slow, deliberate menace. One by one, dark shapes materialized, stepping into the dim light of the clearing. The giant that had taken Hayes was there, its fur matted with his blood. Others joined it, their yellow eyes burning holes in the darkness. 5, 10, at least 15 of them. They formed a silent, unbroken circle around us, their massive forms blocking out all avenues of escape. The woman at the base of the tree never took her eyes off me. She held her child up, a final, heartbreaking accusation. Then she let out a single, piercing shriek. It was not a sound of grief this time. It was a command, an order to attack, an execution order. And as one, the silent circle of giants began to close in. There is no way to describe the absolute sensory overload of the next few minutes. It wasn't a firefight, it was purgatory. It was the end of the world compressed into a 10 by 10 meter clearing. The moment the woman shrieked, the circle of creatures surged forward. There was no tactic anymore, no flanking, no stealth. It was a wave of pure, concentrated fury. My mind went blank. All thought, all fear was burned away by the primal imperative to survive. Fire! I screamed, my voice raw. Our 7 rifles opened up as one. The clearing erupted in a storm of light and sound. The continuous, deafening roar of automatic weapons fire echoed off the trees, turning the small space into an echo chamber from hell. Muzzle flashes lit the scene in brutal, stop-motion tableaus, a gaping maw of fangs, a clawed hand reaching, eyes burning with yellow fire. The first wave hit our wall of lead and faltered. 2 of the giants went down, their massive bodies crashing to the ground with the force of falling trees, but they were replaced instantly. They climbed over their own dead, their rage making them impervious to pain. A creature lunged at Peterson. He screamed as claws tore through his body armor like it was paper. I swung my rifle, firing a burst into its side. It howled and spun, its blood spraying across my face, hot and metallic. The distraction was enough. Kowalski, standing beside me, shoved the barrel of his shotgun into its gut and pulled the trigger. The boom was like a cannon, and the creature was nearly torn in two. "Grenades!" I yelled, pulling the pin on a flashbang. Now, 3 of us threw them. The world went white and silent for a heartbeat. The brilliant flash and concussive bang stunned the creatures, giving us a precious second. We used it to reload, our hands moving with frantic, desperate speed. When my vision cleared, they were coming again. They learned. They were shielding their eyes with their massive forearms. Doc Jensen, our medic, was trying to drag a wounded soldier back when one of them grabbed him from behind. We heard his spine snap, a dry, awful crack that cut through the noise of the battle. It was a meat grinder. We were pouring hundreds of rounds into them, and they just kept coming. For every one that fell, another took its place, its face a twisted mask of fury. The air was a thick, choking soup of gunpowder, blood, and the musky animal stench of our attackers. I was down to my last 2 magazines. We were all running low. This was it, the end. We were going to die here, torn to pieces in this forgotten corner of the world, our bodies left to rot with the bones of their children. I accepted it. In a strange way, a calm washed over me. I wasn't going to die cowering. I slammed my last magazine into my rifle, took aim at the largest one, the one that had killed Hayes, and prepared to sell my life as dearly as possible. And then I heard it. Faintly at first, a rhythmic whump-whump-whump that was not of the forest. It grew louder, cutting through the din of the battle. Helicopter blades, hope, fierce and desperate and utterly illogical, surged through me. I fumbled for my radio. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Ghost 1 Alpha. We are troops in contact. I repeat, troops in contact. We are being overrun." The radio crackled, not with static, but with a voice. A calm, clear voice. "Solid copy, Ghost 1. We're on station." Pop smoke. "We'll bring the rain." I didn't know who they were or where they came from. They weren't our scheduled extraction. But they were here. "Smoke out," I yelled, throwing our last smoke grenade. It landed in the center of the clearing, billowing a thick cloud of green smoke. Seconds later, the sky tore open. The guttural roar of a minigun erupted from above, a sound like a giant tearing a canvas sheet. A stream of tracers, like angry red hornets, ripped through the canopy, shredding leaves, branches, and flesh. The creatures that were not hit shrieked in terror and confusion, momentarily breaking their attack. Through the trees, I saw the searchlight of a Black Hawk stabbing down, turning the green smoke into an ethereal beacon. "Get to the chopper." The famous movie line popped into my head with hysterical absurdity. There were only 4 of us left standing. We ran, we didn't look back. We scrambled over the bodies of our friends and our enemies, running for the light, running for the sound, running for our lives. The extraction was a blur of desperation. We crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces, the roar of the minigun providing a terrifying symphony of covering fire just behind us. The Black Hawk couldn't land. The trees were too thick. It hovered 20 feet above a small rocky clearing, a rope ladder snaking down toward us. "Go, go, go!" I screamed, shoving the soldier in front of me toward the ladder. The creatures were right behind us. I could hear their guttural roars of fury, the sound of their massive bodies crashing through the forest. They weren't giving up. One by one, we scrambled up the ladder, our gear weighing us down, our muscles screaming in protest. I was the last one up. As I clung to the rope, my feet leaving the ground, one of the creatures burst from the tree line. It was the giant. Its face was a mask of blood and hatred. It leaped, its claws outstretched, trying to snatch me out of the air. The claws raked down my leg, tearing through my pants and into my flesh. Pain, white-hot and searing, shot up my side. But it was too late. The helicopter was already gaining altitude, pulling me up and away out of its reach. I tumbled into the cabin and the crew chief slammed the door shut. The world inside was a surreal pocket of red light and urgent professional calm. Medics were already working on the other 2 survivors, both of them wounded. I was the 4th. 4 men out of 12. The pilot's voice crackled over the internal comms, strained with disbelief. "Jesus Christ, they're still coming. They're in the trees. They're keeping pace with us." I crawled to the small window and looked down. He wasn't lying. In the sweeping beam of the searchlight, I could see them. Dark, massive shapes, leaping from treetop to treetop with the agility of giant apes, their yellow eyes glowing in the dark. They were following us, a silent, furious escort. Then the forest behind us erupted in a series of brilliant orange fireballs. The second helicopter, an Apache gunship I hadn't even seen, was cleaning up. It unleashed a volley of hellfire missiles into the clearing where we had made our stand. The explosions lit up the night, and for a brief, horrifying moment I saw the woman. She was still standing at the base of the cedar tree, her dead child in her arms, looking up at us as the fire consumed her. Her face held no fear, only that same terrible burning hatred. The flight back was silent. The roar of the engines was a wall of sound, but inside that wall was a vacuum. No one spoke. The medics worked quietly, efficiently. The crew chiefs stared out the windows, their faces pale. We, the survivors, just sat, huddled in our own private shells of shock and horror. I stared at the blood on my hands, a mixture of my own and theirs. The weight of what we had done, what we had seen, was beginning to settle. We had gone looking for drug dealers and found a living nightmare, a lost chapter of human evolution, and we had burned it to the ground. When we landed back at the forward operating base, it wasn't to a hero's welcome. There was no debriefing. The moment we stepped off the helicopter, we were surrounded by a different kind of soldier. They wore sterile black uniforms with no insignia. They carried weapons I didn't recognize. Their faces were grim and impassive. They didn't speak to us. They just separated us. "On your feet, Sergeant," one of them said, his voice devoid of any emotion. They escorted each of us to separate windowless medical tents. My gear was taken. My wounds were treated by a silent doctor who wouldn't meet my eyes. Then I was left alone in a white room with a cot, a bottle of water, and an armed guard standing outside my door. The quarantine wasn't for our health. It was to keep us quiet. The mission was over, but the cover-up was just beginning. I spent 3 days in that white room. 3 days of silence, punctuated only by the changing of the guard and the delivery of sterile food trays. 3 days for the images to burn themselves onto the inside of my eyelids. Pharaoh's body hitting the tree, the captain being dragged into the dark, the haunted, childlike face of the creature we killed, the mother's eyes as the fire took her. On the 4th day, 2 men in Air Force dress blues came for me. They didn't introduce themselves. They walked me to another, more permanent building and into a windowless, soundproofed room. A single steel table and 3 chairs were the only furniture. A man in a plain dark suit was already sitting there. He looked like a tax accountant, but his eyes were as cold and dead as a shark's. "Sit down, Sergeant Corrigan," he said. It wasn't a request. He opened a thin folder. It contained a single sheet of paper. "I'm here to conduct your official debriefing of Operation Sundown. For the record, please state what you and your team encountered in the objective area." My voice was a dry rasp. "We were attacked, hunted by—" I hesitated. What could I say? "By creatures, bipedal, 8 feet tall, covered in fur. They were intelligent, coordinated." The man listened without a change in expression. He didn't take notes. When I was finished, he slid the paper across the table. It was a pre-written statement. "Thank you, Sergeant. Now this is what you will sign." This is what happened. I picked it up and read. The report stated that ODA 724 had located a heavily fortified compound belonging to a new radicalized faction of the Sinaloa cartel. It said the enemy combatants were a fanatical death squad, operating under the influence of a powerful and undocumented psychotropic drug cocktail, likely including PCP and bath salts. It mentioned their use of primitive animalistic tactics and body armor made from cured hides. It concluded that the 8 American casualties were the result of a fierce, close-quarters firefight against a numerically superior and unexpectedly savage enemy force. There was no mention of giant footprints, of a destroyed cabin filled with children's bones, of creatures that looked like werewolves from a fever dream. There was no mention of the woman or her dead child. It was a lie. Her clean, simple, digestible lie. "I'm not signing this," I said, pushing the paper back. "This isn't what happened." The man in the suit finally looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It was pity mixed with a cold, hard threat. "Sergeant," he said, his voice soft and dangerous, "what happened in that forest was a tragedy, but it was also a biological anomaly, an isolated, localized event that is now, for all intents and purposes, sterilized. The official report exists for reasons of national security and public health. It prevents panic. It prevents questions that have no good answers." He leaned forward. "Your testimony, the one you just gave me, would be considered the rantings of a man suffering from severe combat-related PTSD. It would end your career. You would be discredited, dishonorably discharged, and you would spend a very long time in a psychiatric facility. Your signature on this document ensures that you and your surviving men receive the full honors and benefits you are owed. It ensures that the families of the fallen receive a story they can understand and a flag they can be proud of." He was trapping me. He was telling me that the price of the truth was my sanity, my honor, and the peace of the families who had lost everything. I sat there for a long time, the silence pressing in. I thought of Hayes's wife, of Pharaoh's parents. What could I tell them? That their son was killed by a Bigfoot? That their husband was torn apart by something out of a horror movie? With a hand that felt like it was carved from lead, I picked up the pen and signed my name to the lie. The man nodded, collected the paper, and stood up. "You'll be flown back to the States tomorrow. You'll sign a dozen more non-disclosure agreements. You will never speak of what you think you saw. This conversation never happened. Is that clear?" I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. 2 months later, back at Fort Bragg, I heard the news. Specialist Davis, our tracker, the quiet kid from Montana who had first looked into the face of their dead child, had driven his truck out into the middle of the Uwharrie National Forest and shot himself. He left no note. That night, as I was packing his personal effects to be sent to his family, something fell out of a small pouch on his web gear. It was the small carved wooden wolf, the one I had found in the cabin, the child's toy. He must have picked it up. I don't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to put it in the box. I slipped it into my pocket, and I've carried it with me ever since. A small, smooth wooden reminder of the truth. It's been 10 years. I'm not Sergeant Corrigan anymore. I'm just Mike, a man who runs a small charter fishing boat off the coast of Florida, a man who tries to lose himself in the endless blue of the ocean, hoping the salt and the sun can bleach the memories out. But they never fade. I'm out of the army. I took a medical discharge. The official reason was the leg injury from the extraction. The real reason was the nightmares. They never stopped. I see the faces in the dark, the burning yellow eyes. I wake up with the woman's accusatory scream ringing in my ears. The army doctors called it severe chronic PTSD. They gave me pills and therapy, but how do you treat a wound when you can't even tell the doctor what caused it? How do you explain that you're haunted by the ghosts of things that officially never existed? For years, I tried to believe the lie. I tried to convince myself it was just drugs, just crazed cartel killers, that we were the good guys ambushed by savages. But I can't. The lie doesn't account for the footprints. It doesn't explain their impossible speed and strength. It doesn't explain the profound human grief in that final roar. The truth is so much heavier. We were the invaders. We walked into their home, their last sanctuary on this earth, a place so remote they had been able to hide from the modern world. We saw their young, and in our ignorance and fear we labeled them monsters. We were the ones who broke the cradle. We were the ones who fired the first shot in a war we didn't even know we were starting. The cartel story was just a convenient excuse, a way for some shadowy government agency to send in a deniable asset to see if the whispers coming out of the Sierra were true. We weren't a recon team. We were bait, and when the bait was taken, they didn't send a rescue mission. They sent an extermination squad. They sterilized the biological anomaly. They wiped them off the face of the earth, buried the truth under a mountain of classified documents, and called it a victory. I still have the small wooden wolf. It sits on my bedside table. Sometimes late at night I pick it up. The wood is dark and smooth, and I think about the small clawed hand that must have held it, a child's hand. I think about the family we destroyed. They weren't evil. They were just other, and they were defending their home, their children, from the real monsters, from us. I live by the ocean now, but my heart is still in the mountains. Some nights when a storm blows in from the west, the wind carries a strange sound across the water. It's low and mournful. It reminds me of the wind that moaned through those ancient pines in the Sierra Madre. And sometimes, very late when the world is quiet and I am alone with my thoughts, I think I can hear something else in that wind. A low metallic growl carried on the air from a great distance, an echo from the south. An echo of something that wasn't completely sterilized, a promise that some things can never be truly buried, a whisper that reminds me that I was there. I saw them. And I will carry the weight of their extinction until the day I die. Thanks so much for sticking with me through this entire story. If you felt that chill down your spine, if you got lost in the Sierra with Sergeant Corrigan, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel out. Make sure you're subscribed and have the notification bell turned on so you don't miss the next narrative. And I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. Until next time, stay safe and be careful what whispers you listen to in the wind.